90% of Cambodia's classical dancers were murdered between 1975 and 1979. Not caught in crossfire, not collateral damage, hunted, catalogued, and executed because they knew how to move their hands in ways that were 1,000 years old. The Khmer Rouge didn't stumble into cultural destruction. They designed it. Under Pol Pot's regime, the elimination of artists, musicians, and dancers was a deliberate pillar of revolutionary policy as calculated as the emptying of the cities or the abolition of currency. But what made the targeting of the Royal Ballet uniquely devastating? What wouldn't fully surface until researchers combed through the meticulous torture records of S-21 prison decades later was the precision of it. The regime didn't just kill dancers, they killed a living library, an unbroken chain of physical memory stretching back to the Angkor Empire, and they knew exactly what they were erasing. This is the story of how a revolution tried to murder an art form, and of the handful of survivors who refused to let it die. Cambodian classical dance, known as Robam Kbach Boran, was never written down. There were no notation systems, no textbooks, no video archives for most of its history. The choreography, thousands of gestures, each with precise spiritual and narrative meaning, existed only in the muscles and memory of the dancers who performed it. A master taught a student through years of physical repetition, bending fingers into position, shaping the arch of a foot, correcting the angle of a wrist by fractions of a degree. When a master died without passing on her knowledge, whatever she carried vanished from the earth. By the mid-20th century, the Royal Ballet had become Cambodia's most visible cultural institution. Queen Sisawath Kosamak, grandmother of King Norodom Sihanouk, personally oversaw its development through the 1940s and 1950s, expanding the repertoire and elevating dancers to the status of national treasures. The company performed at state functions, international tours, and temple ceremonies. The lead dancers, women like Princess Norodom Bofa Devi, Sihanouk's own daughter, were among the most recognized figures in the country. This visibility would become a death sentence. When the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975, they emptied the capital within 72 hours. 2 million people were forced into the countryside at gunpoint. Hospitals were evacuated mid-surgery. The new regime, led by Pol Pot and his inner circle of Paris-educated ideologues, declared it year zero. History was starting over. Everything before, every institution, every tradition, every form of knowledge that connected Cambodians to their past was an enemy of the revolution. The classification system was blunt and absolute. The Khmer Rouge divided the population into old people, rural peasants considered ideologically pure, and new people, the urban evacuees marked for re-education or elimination. But within the new people, certain categories drew special attention: teachers, monks, doctors, musicians, dancers. Anyone whose skill or knowledge marked them as part of the old culture was flagged as a cultural intellectual, a designation that carried an almost certain death sentence. The Royal Ballet dancers couldn't hide what they were. Years of training had shaped their bodies in ways that were immediately recognizable. The hyperextended fingers, the particular musculature of the calves and feet, even stripped of costumes and makeup, forced into black peasant clothing and put to work in the rice paddies. They were identifiable, and they were identified. Tuol Sleng, the former high school in Phnom Penh, converted into the regime's most notorious interrogation center, processed an estimated 17,000 prisoners between 1975 and 1979. Fewer than a dozen survived. The prison's commander, Khmer Rouge Eva, known as Dutch, ran it with bureaucratic thoroughness. Every prisoner was photographed, documented, and forced to write a confession before execution. The archive that survived is one of the most complete records of state-sponsored killing ever assembled. Within those records, researchers later found the names: dancers from the Royal Ballet, musicians from the National Orchestra, choreographers, costume makers, mask carvers. They had been arrested, transported to Tuol Sleng, interrogated about their connections to the royal court and the Sihanouk government, and killed. The confessions are formulaic. The regime extracted whatever narrative it wanted, but the biographical details are real. Name: Age, profession, royal dancer, court musician. These entries confirm what survivors had long testified. The killings were not random. The regime tracked these people down. But Tuol Sleng was only the most documented site. The greatest slaughter happened in the countryside, at the hundreds of killing fields scattered across Cambodia, where executions were carried out with farm tools to save bullets. Many dancers died there, unnamed, in mass graves that are still being excavated. The full accounting will never be complete. Consider what it means to kill 90% of the practitioners of an art form that exists only in human bodies. It is not like burning a library. A library can be reprinted from copies held elsewhere. This was more like burning the only speakers of a language. When master dancer Soth Sam On was executed, a woman who had spent 40 years learning and teaching roles that took a decade to master, every piece of choreography she alone carried forward disappeared with her. Entire categories of dance were lost. The repertoire of the Royal Ballet before 1975 included dozens of works, many drawn from the Ramkha, Cambodia's version of the Ramayana. Some roles had been passed down through specific lineages of dancers for generations. When the lineage holders died, the dances died. Surviving dancers later described the experience of trying to reconstruct the repertoire from memory, only to reach a passage and realize that the only person who knew the next sequence was gone. They would stand in rehearsal, hands frozen mid-gesture, staring at the space where knowledge used to be. The musicians suffered the same fate. The Pol Pot ensemble, the orchestra that accompanied classical dance, required years of training on instruments like the ronit, ek, and the sralai. Instrument makers were killed, instruments were burned or smashed. The Khmer Rouge saw musical instruments as symbols of feudal decadence. Owning one could get you executed. When Vietnamese forces drove the Khmer Rouge from Phnom Penh in January 1979, Cambodia was a shattered country. Between 1.5 and 2 million people had died, roughly a quarter of the population. Among the survivors of the Royal Ballet, the count was devastating. Depending on the source, between 12 and 30 master-level dancers and musicians had survived, scattered across the country, many in poor health from years of forced labor and starvation. The reconstruction began almost immediately, driven by an urgency that outsiders sometimes struggled to understand. The country was starving. Infrastructure was destroyed. Landmines littered the countryside. Why prioritize dance? Because the survivors understood something fundamental. If the last masters died before passing on what they knew, the loss would be permanent in a way that a bombed bridge or a burned hospital was not. Buildings can be rebuilt from blueprints. An art form preserved only in aging bodies cannot wait. In Thay, one of the surviving dancers became a central figure in the reconstruction effort. In her 60s, weakened by years in the camps, she began teaching again, working with young students at the newly reopened University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh. She reconstructed choreography from memory, gesture by gesture, acknowledging openly where gaps existed. Other survivors joined her. Proing Chieng, who had been a young dancer before the regime, helped rebuild the institutional framework. Princess Bofa Devi, who had survived in exile, returned to Cambodia and threw her influence behind the revival. The recovery was partial by definition. What the survivors could reconstruct was what they personally remembered, filtered through years of trauma and physical deterioration. Roles they had never performed were gone. Variations they had seen but not learned were gone. The rebuilt repertoire was narrower, and the surviving dancers knew it. They spoke about this openly, the haunting awareness that what they were teaching was an incomplete version of what they had once known. In 2003, UNESCO inscribed Cambodian Royal Ballet on its list of masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. The designation brought international attention and funding, but it also underscored a painful irony. The art form was being celebrated precisely because it had nearly been annihilated. Its fragility was the point. A new generation of dancers trained under the survivors, learning what could be passed on, accepting the gaps. Some choreographers began creating new works, not to replace what was lost, but to acknowledge that the tradition was now a living thing again, capable of growth rather than mere preservation. The tension between conservation and evolution became the central question of Cambodian dance in the 21st century. Thay died in 2016, at the age of 88. With her passing, another fragment of pre-revolution knowledge left the world. Each time one of the surviving masters dies, the window closes a little further. The choreography they reconstructed is now being taught to a third generation, students who learn from teachers who learned from survivors. The chain has been relinked, but it is thinner than it was, and everyone involved knows it. The story of the Cambodian Royal Ballet is often folded into the broader narrative of the Khmer Rouge genocide, treated as one more category of loss in a catastrophe that defies full accounting. But there is something specific in the destruction of an embodied art form that resists generalization. A dancer's knowledge is not an idea that can be rediscovered. It is not a theorem waiting to be rederived. It is a particular way of holding the body that took centuries to develop and seconds to destroy. The surviving dancers understood this with a clarity that bordered on desperation. They taught through pain, through age, through the weight of knowing that what they carried was irreplaceable. In the rehearsal halls of Phnom Penh, young dancers now bend their fingers into positions that are 1,000 years old and 40 years reconstructed, moving through choreography that is both ancient and fragile, preserved not in stone or ink, but in the only medium it has ever known, the human body, passing its knowledge forward, one gesture at a time, before the hands go still.